The whispers followed Katherine Hayes like shadows across the dusty planked floors of Silverton's only saloon. Her trembling hands clutched a tray of whiskey glasses as she navigated through the maze of tables filled with boisterous miners, card players, and weary travelers passing through the Colorado Territory in 1875. 3 months in this position, and still the words mute, simple, and odd trailed behind her like a curse. "Girl hasn't said more than 10 words since she started," muttered Henry Coleman, the saloon's regular who fancied himself the unofficial mayor of their corner of the establishment. "Might as well hire a ghost," another chimed in, taking his drink without acknowledging Catherine's presence. Catherine's cheeks burned as she collected empty glasses from a nearby table. At 20 years old, she had learned that silence offered protection. Words exposed vulnerabilities, invited judgment, created expectations she could never fulfill. Her aunt had warned her about this job, suggested she find work at the general store instead, but the saloon paid better wages, and with her father gone, every penny mattered. "Hey, Hayes," Coleman called out, waving his empty glass. "Got anything to say today, or you still playing at being mute?" Katherine moved toward him, eyes downcast, when the saloon doors swung open with force that sent dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight. The room quieted as a man stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a worn Stetson. His spurs jingled softly as he approached the bar, the only sound in the suddenly quiet room. Howard Lawson had ridden into Silverton 3 days prior, carrying little but his reputation. Word traveled fast that he was a former Texas Ranger turned cattle driver, now hired by the Silver Peak Mining Company to escort their shipments safely through territories plagued by outlaws. His presence commanded respect without demanding it. "Whiskey," he said to the barkeeper, his voice low and steady like distant thunder. Katherine kept her head down as she passed behind him, hoping to blend into the background as she always did. "Hayes," Coleman called again, louder this time. "You deaf as well as dumb? I said I need another drink." The saloon erupted in laughter. Katherine froze, mortification spreading through her like wildfire. Then she felt eyes on her, turned slightly to find Howard Lawson observing the exchange, his gaze steady beneath the brim of his hat. "The lady heard you fine," Lawson said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. "Maybe she just doesn't think you're worth the breath to answer." Coleman's face reddened. "What's it to you, Ranger? The girl's been here 3 months and barely speaks. Something ain't right with her." Lawson took his whiskey from the bartender, turned to face the room. "Some folks talk too much and say nothing. Others say little and mean every word." His eyes met Catherine's, held them for a moment that stretched between them like an invisible thread. "Her silence speaks volumes to me." The words settled in the room like a physical presence. Katherine felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, not embarrassment or shame, but something warmer, something that felt strangely like gratitude. That evening, as Katherine swept the empty saloon after closing, she heard the door open behind her. Howard Lawson stood there, hat in hand, the moonlight casting long shadows behind him. "Miss Hayes," he said with a slight nod, "I came to apologize if I caused you any discomfort earlier." Katherine gripped her broom tighter, struggling to find words. "You didn't," she finally managed, her voice soft from disuse. A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "She speaks when I have something worth saying," Katherine replied, surprising herself with her boldness. A wise philosophy. He took a step closer. "I've got a job escorting a mining payroll to Durango next week. 3 days' journey. They need someone to cook for the men. Pays well." He paused. "Thought you might want a change of scenery, away from folks who don't appreciate the value of careful words." Katherine stared at him, wondering how this stranger could see what no one else had bothered to notice. "Why would you offer that to me?" "Because I've known too many loud fools and not enough quiet thinkers," he answered simply. "And because a person shouldn't be mocked for their nature." That night, Katherine lay awake in her small room above her aunt's dress shop, thinking about Howard Lawson's offer. She had never ventured far from Silverton, had never dared to imagine herself anywhere else. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The next morning she found him at the livery stable, checking his horse's shoes. "I'll do it," she said, standing as tall as her 5'3" frame would allow. "I'll cook for your expedition." Howard looked up, surprise briefly crossing his weathered features before settling into that same quiet smile. "We leave at dawn on Monday. Pack light." 5 days later, Katherine found herself perched on the edge of a wagon seat, watching Silverton disappear around the mountain bend. Beside her, Howard handled the reins with practiced ease, his presence solid and reassuring. Behind them rode 4 men, 2 guards from the mining company and 2 assistants for the journey. "Having second thoughts?" Howard asked, noticing her backward glance. Katherine shook her head. "No, just... I've never been this far from home before. First time for everything," he replied, eyes scanning the horizon with habitual vigilance. "The trail's peaceful this time of year. Should be a smooth journey." The first day passed uneventfully, the wagon climbing steadily into higher elevations where ponderosa pines stood sentinel along the trail. Katherine prepared meals over an open fire, grateful that cooking required no excessive conversation. The men seemed content with her simple fare, especially after days of hardtack and jerky on previous journeys. That evening, as the others played cards by firelight, Howard joined Katherine where she sat at the edge of camp, staring at the vast canopy of stars above. "Mind some company?" he asked. She shook her head, making room on the fallen log where she sat. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, looking upward. "Sky like this makes a man realize how small his troubles really are." Katherine nodded, finding it easier to be silent with someone who didn't demand she fill the empty spaces with words. "You're good with the cooking," he commented after a while. "Where'd you learn?" "My mother," she answered softly, "before she passed. Then I cooked for my father until—" She trailed off. Howard didn't press. "Lost mine in '65. War took him, though he died in Texas, not on any battlefield. Mine was last winter." "Pneumonia," Katherine offered, surprised at how easily the words came. "Left me with just my aunt in Silverton." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer before Howard spoke again. "I've known a lot of brave men in my time, Miss Hayes, but it takes a special kind of courage to face a world that misunderstands you every day." Katherine turned to look at him, really look at him for perhaps the first time. The firelight caught the silver streaks in his brown hair, the lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years squinting against sun and wind. His face was weathered but kind, with an underlying strength that had nothing to do with physical power. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since the saloon. Howard considered this for a moment. "My sister was like you, preferred silence to idle chatter. Folks called her slow, but she was the smartest person I knew, just processed things differently." A shadow crossed his face. "Lost her too young. Whenever I see someone being misjudged the way she was, well, I can't stand by quiet." "I'm sorry about your sister," Katherine said, meaning it. "It was a long time ago." He stood, offering his hand to help her up. "We should get some rest. Early start tomorrow." As she took his hand, Katherine felt something shift between them, a connection forming as delicate and significant as the first frost of winter. The second day brought them deeper into the mountain passes. the wagon wheels creaking as they navigated increasingly treacherous terrain. By midday, dark clouds gathered above them, threatening rain. "There's a way station about 3 miles ahead," Howard informed the group. "We'll shelter there until the weather passes." The rain began just as the small outpost came into view, a sturdy log building with a stable attached. They hurried inside, unloading only what was necessary, the mining company men keeping close watch on the lockbox containing the payroll. The way station keeper, an elderly man named Garrett, welcomed them with a gruff nod. "Storm's been brewing since morning, likely to last through the night." While the men tended to the horses, Katherine set about preparing a meal from their supplies and what the station had available. The small kitchen was a welcome change from cooking over an open fire, and she lost herself in the familiar rhythms of chopping, stirring, and seasoning. She didn't notice Howard watching her from the doorway until he spoke. "You look at home here." Katherine glanced up, a small smile touching her lips. "Kitchens make sense to me. Everything has its place and purpose." "Unlike people," he observed. "Exactly unlike people," she agreed, surprising herself with her candor. He stepped inside, rolling up his sleeves. "Need a hand?" Together they worked in companionable silence, moving around each other with unexpected ease, as if they'd done this dance 100 times before. When their hands accidentally brushed as they reached for the same pot, Katherine felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove's heat. That night, as rain pounded against the station's roof and thunder rolled across the mountains, the travelers gathered around the common room's fireplace. The mining company men engaged Howard in conversation about trail conditions ahead, while Katherine sat quietly in a corner, darning a tear in her shawl. One of the younger guards, a man named Jenkins, approached her hesitantly. "Miss Hayes, I was wondering if you might look at this." He held out a folded piece of paper. "It's a letter to my sweetheart back in Denver. I'm not much for words, and the boys say it needs work." Katherine set aside her mending and carefully took the letter. As she read, she could feel Howard's eyes on her from across the room. Jenkins had clearly struggled with expressing his feelings, the sentences awkward and stilted. With a soft smile, she looked up at the nervous young man. "It's very heartfelt," she said gently. "May I make a few suggestions?" Jenkins nodded eagerly, and for the next hour, Katherine helped him reshape his thoughts into words his sweetheart would treasure. It was the most she had spoken at one time in years, but with Howard's approving gaze occasionally meeting hers across the room, she found the words came more easily than expected. Later, as the others retired to their sleeping arrangements, Howard found her still by the fire, staring into the flames. "That was a kind thing you did for Jenkins," he said, settling into the chair beside her. Katherine shrugged slightly. "Words come easier when they're for someone else. You have a gift with them when you choose to use it." "I used to love books," she confessed, the firelight casting dancing shadows across her face. "My father taught at the schoolhouse before he fell ill. Our home was full of them." "What happened?" Howard asked, his voice gentle. Katherine hesitated, then found herself wanting to share the truth with this man who had shown her nothing but respect. "After Mother died, I changed. Words wouldn't come out right anymore. Children at school laughed. Adults whispered. Father understood, but others." She trailed off, looking down at her hands. It was easier to say nothing than to be judged for saying the wrong thing. Howard nodded slowly. "People fear what they don't understand, and there's comfort in labeling others makes them feel they've got the world figured out." "And you?" Katherine asked, raising her eyes to meet his. "What labels have people put on you?" A smile touched his lips. "Dangerous, cold, loner." He leaned back in his chair. "But I reckon we're all more complicated than the stories others tell about us." In that moment, Katherine saw beyond the weathered exterior to the man beneath, someone who, like her, had been reduced to simple descriptions that missed the truth of who he was. "I think," she said carefully, "that you see people more clearly than most." "Not all people," he replied. "Just the ones worth seeing." The storm raged through the night, but within the walls of the way station, something quiet and profound was taking root between two souls accustomed to solitude. Morning brought clearing skies and renewed urgency to their journey. As they loaded the wagon and prepared to depart, Katherine noticed a new easiness in her interactions with the other men. Jenkins, especially, treated her with a newfound respect that had nothing to do with pity. The trail beyond the way station climbed higher into the mountains, the air growing thinner and cooler with each mile. Howard pointed out landmarks along the way: an unusual rock formation, an abandoned mining claim, the distant silhouette of a mountain lion watching from a high ridge. "You know these mountains well," Katherine observed during a brief stop to rest the horses. "Spent 5 years as a scout for the Army before joining the Rangers," Howard explained. "Learned to read the land like others read books." He handed her a canteen. "A man could spend a lifetime exploring these ranges and still find new wonders." "It must be lonely," she said, taking a careful sip of water. Howard's eyes met hers. "Alone and lonely aren't always the same thing." By late afternoon, they reached a plateau overlooking a steep ravine. The trail ahead narrowed dangerously, forcing them to proceed with greater caution. "We'll make camp here," Howard announced. "Better to tackle that descent in morning light." As Katherine prepared the evening meal, she noticed tension among the mining company men. They spoke in hushed voices, occasionally glancing toward the lockbox secured beneath the wagon seat. "Problem?" Howard asked, approaching their huddled conversation. The senior guard, a hard-faced man named Monroe, straightened up. "Heard rumors in Silverton before we left. Carson gang might be operating in these parts again." "Carson gang's been quiet for months," Howard replied, though Katherine noticed his hand resting casually closer to his holstered revolver. "Just saying we should post double watch tonight," Monroe insisted. Howard nodded in agreement. "I'll take first shift with Jenkins. You and Davis can relieve us at midnight." That night, as the others slept, Katherine found herself wide awake, listening to the night sounds of the mountain wilderness. Rising quietly, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped carefully from the wagon where she'd been sleeping. Howard sat near the dying embers of their campfire, his profile illuminated by moonlight. He turned at her approach, hand instinctively moving toward his gun before relaxing. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly as she sat beside him. Katherine shook her head. "Too many thoughts. Want to share them?" She hesitated, organizing her words carefully before speaking. "I keep thinking about Silverton, about how different everything feels out here." She gestured to the vast landscape surrounding them. "Like I'm becoming someone else with every mile." "Not becoming," Howard corrected gently. "Discovering. The real Katherine Hayes was always there, just waiting for space to breathe." She smiled at that, a genuine smile that transformed her usually solemn features. "Is that how it was for you, when you left home?" Howard considered this, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their camp with habitual vigilance. "Partly, but I was running from something." "You're running towards something. There's a difference." "What were you running from?" she asked, then quickly added, "if you don't mind telling." He was quiet for so long that Katherine thought he wouldn't answer. Then, expectations, family legacy. "My father and grandfather were both lawmen in the same county. Died the same way too, enforcing laws other men wrote." He poked at the embers with a stick, sending sparks floating upward. "I wanted something different but ended up with a badge anyway, just farther from home. And now." Now I make my own rules. Take the jobs that seem right, leave the ones that don't." He looked at her directly. "That's real freedom, not the absence of responsibility, but the ability to choose which responsibilities are yours." Katherine absorbed his words, feeling their truth resonate within her. "I've never chosen anything before," she admitted. "Life just happened around me." "What would you choose now if you could?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities. Katherine looked up at the star-strewn sky, then back at the man beside her, this stranger who somehow saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. "I think," she said carefully, "I would choose to stop being afraid of my own voice." Howard's smile was worth every word she'd mustered the courage to speak. "That's a fine place to start." Their conversation continued in hushed tones through the night, words flowing more freely between them with each passing hour. Katherine shared stories of her childhood in Silverton, of her scholarly father and gentle mother, of the books that had once been her closest companions. Howard spoke of his years ranging across the territories, of the beauty and danger he'd witnessed, of moments of unexpected grace in harsh landscapes. By the time Jenkins came to relieve Howard of his watch, something profound had shifted between them, a connection that went beyond the circumstantial companionship of their journey. The dawn broke clear and cold over the mountains as they prepared to navigate the treacherous trail ahead. Howard studied the narrow path with concern. "We'll need to lighten the wagon," he announced. "Trail's too steep for a full load." The mining company men protested immediately, unwilling to leave either the payroll or their supplies behind. "We'll carry what we can," Howard instructed, brooking no argument. "Make multiple trips if necessary. Katherine and I will take the wagon down first, then come back for whatever remains." The descent was nerve-wracking, the wagon wheels sliding on loose shale despite Howard's expert handling of the reins. Katherine gripped the seat beside him, her knuckles white with tension as they inched downward. Halfway down, a wheel struck a boulder, jolting them violently. "Hold on," Howard shouted as the wagon tilted precariously. Katherine felt herself sliding, heard Howard call her name, then found herself tumbling down the steep embankment. Pain exploded in her ankle as she rolled, finally coming to rest against a pine tree 20 feet below the trail. Howard was beside her in an instant, having leaped from the wagon the moment he'd secured the reins. His hands gently examined her for injuries, his face tight with concern. "Katherine, can you hear me? Where are you hurt?" She winced as she tried to move. "My ankle. I think it's sprained, not broken." Relief washed over his features. "Can you stand with help?" With Howard's support, she managed to get to her feet, though she couldn't put weight on her injured ankle. Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms, carrying her back up to the trail where the wagon now rested at a precarious angle, but had not overturned. "We need to get you to level ground," he said, his voice steady despite the strain of carrying her up the steep slope. "The wagon should hold if we take it slow." With Katherine secured on the seat beside him, Howard carefully guided the wagon the rest of the way down the ravine, every muscle tense with concentration. When they finally reached level ground, he immediately set about making her comfortable, fashioning a compress for her ankle from his own spare shirt soaked in cool stream water. "You're good at this," Katherine observed as he wrapped her ankle with practiced efficiency. "Had my share of injuries in the field," he replied, his touch gentle despite his calloused hands. "Though I prefer patching up horses to people, they complain less." She laughed softly, the sound surprising them both. "I doubt I've complained enough in my entire life." Howard's eyes met hers, serious despite his light tone. "Some complaints are worth voicing. Pain shouldn't be suffered in silence." As he finished tending to her ankle, his hand lingered longer than necessary, a touch that spoke of more than medical concern. Katherine felt her breath catch, suddenly aware of how close he was, of the warmth of his skin against hers. The moment was broken by shouts from above, as the mining company men began making their way down the trail with the remaining supplies. Howard reluctantly moved away, resuming his role as expedition leader. For the remainder of the day, they traveled slowly along the valley floor, the delay from Katherine's injury and the difficult descent putting them behind schedule. Howard insisted she ride in the wagon, cushioning her injured ankle with bedrolls and checking on her frequently. By evening, they made camp beside a small creek, the towering walls of the ravine providing shelter from the wind. Katherine attempted to help with dinner preparations despite her injury, but Howard gently steered her toward a comfortable spot by the fire. "Rest," he insisted. "I can manage a pot of beans without burning them, probably." She watched as he moved around the campfire, competent despite his self-deprecation. The mining company men kept to themselves, their anxiety about the delay and the payroll manifesting as sullen silence. After a simple meal, Howard brought Katherine a cup of coffee laced with a small measure of whiskey. "For the pain," he explained, settling beside her. She accepted it gratefully. "Thank you for everything today." "No need for thanks," he replied, his voice low. "I shouldn't have asked you to ride down that trail. It was too dangerous." "It wasn't your fault," she insisted. "And I'm not fragile, Howard." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing beyond the quiet exterior to the strength beneath. "No," he agreed softly. "You're certainly not that." In the flickering firelight, Katherine felt an unfamiliar boldness. "Why did you really ask me to join this expedition? There must have been other cooks available in Silverton." Howard was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the flames. "Because I recognized something in you," he finally said. "A kind of solitude that wasn't by choice. I know what that's like." "And now," she prompted when he didn't continue, his gaze returned to her face, intense and unguarded. "Now I'm wondering what it might be like to be less solitary. With the right person." The words hung between them, charged with meaning. Katherine felt her heart quicken, emotions she'd never allowed herself to acknowledge rising to the surface. Before she could respond, a shout from the edge of camp shattered the moment. "Riders coming." Monroe called, grabbing his rifle. "At least 5 of them." Howard was on his feet instantly, his hand on his revolver. "Get behind the wagon," he ordered Katherine, helping her to her feet, "and stay down." From their position, they could see figures approaching through the gathering dusk, horsemen moving with purpose toward their camp. Howard positioned himself between the approaching riders and the wagon, his stance relaxed, but alert. "That's close enough," he called out when the riders were within 50 yards. The lead horseman raised his hands to show he was unarmed. "No trouble, friend. Just passing through and saw your fire." Despite the pacifying words, there was something predatory in the way the men spread out as they approached. "Trails open to all," Howard replied evenly, "but our camp is private." The leader, a lean man with a pockmarked face, smiled without warmth. "Mighty unfriendly for these parts. We're just looking for a bit of hospitality. Maybe share your fire for the night." From her position behind the wagon, Katherine could see Monroe and Davis tensing, their hands hovering near their weapons. The situation was balancing on a knife's edge, and she knew with sudden certainty that these men were the Carson gang Monroe had mentioned. What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion. One of the riders made a sudden move toward his holster, and gunfire erupted across the camp. Howard dove for cover, returning fire with deadly accuracy. Katherine pressed herself against the wagon wheel, heart pounding as bullets splintered wood inches from her head. The exchange was over in moments. Two of the attacking riders down, another clutching a wounded arm. The leader and the remaining man wheeled their horses around, firing wildly as they retreated into the darkness. "They'll be back," Howard said grimly, checking on the mining company men. Davis had taken a bullet to the shoulder, while Jenkins and Monroe were shaken but unharmed. "And with more men next time." They worked quickly to fortify their position, moving the wagon to provide better cover and distributing ammunition. Howard helped Katherine to a protected spot behind a fallen log, pressing a small derringer into her hand. "Just in case," he said, his face grim in the firelight. "I don't intend to let them get this close to you." Katherine gripped the unfamiliar weapon, fear and determination warring within her. "What do they want?" "The payroll, primarily," Howard answered, checking his revolver. "But men like that take whatever they can get." The threat behind his words was clear, and Katherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain night. "What can I do to help?" Howard's expression softened momentarily. "Keep your head down and stay alive." "That'll help me more than anything." As he turned to go, Katherine caught his arm. "Howard." When he looked back, she forced herself to say the words that might never have another chance to be spoken. "Whatever happens, I'm glad I met you." He covered her hand with his own. "We'll have time for proper goodbyes later, Katherine. I promise you that." The night stretched endlessly, every sound in the darkness a potential threat. Howard moved between positions, coordinating their defense with Monroe while Jenkins tended to Davis's wound. Katherine kept watch from her protected position, the derringer clutched in trembling hands. Near midnight, they came more riders than before, approaching from multiple directions. Gunfire erupted once more, muzzle flashes illuminating the night in staccato bursts of orange light. Katherine heard Howard's voice calling commands over the chaos, steadying the others with his calm authority. A shadow moved at the edge of Katherine's vision. One of the attackers had circled behind their position and was approaching the wagon where the lockbox was secured. Without thinking, she raised the derringer, aimed as her father had once taught her on hunting trips long ago, and fired. The man fell with a cry of pain, clutching his leg. The sound drew Howard's attention, and he was beside Katherine in an instant, a fresh revolver in his hand. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, eyes scanning her for injuries. Katherine shook her head, strangely calm despite the danger. "He was going for the wagon." Howard glanced at the wounded man, then back at Katherine with newfound respect. "Remind me never to underestimate you." The firefight continued for what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes. The attackers, facing unexpected resistance, eventually withdrew into the darkness, taking their wounded with them. In the sudden silence that followed, Katherine could hear only the ringing in her ears and the ragged breathing of the men around her. Howard moved through the camp, checking on everyone. Davis's wound was painful but not life-threatening. Monroe had suffered a graze to his arm, while Jenkins remained unharmed. Katherine watched as Howard efficiently organized them, setting watches and tending injuries with the same calm competence he brought to everything. When he finally returned to her side, exhaustion was evident in the set of his shoulders. "They may try again before dawn," he said, settling beside her behind the log, "or they may decide we're not worth the trouble." "What do you think they'll do?" Katherine asked, handing him a canteen. He drank deeply before answering. "If it's really the Carson gang, they don't give up easily, but they're pragmatists, not fanatics. 4 men down might be enough to convince them to find easier prey." They sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of their situation settling between them. Then, to Katherine's surprise, Howard chuckled softly. "What could possibly be funny right now?" she asked. He shook his head, a rueful smile touching his lips. "Just thinking that when I offered you this job, I promised a smooth journey away from folks who didn't appreciate you. Some promise that turned out to be." Despite everything, Katherine found herself smiling too. "I don't recall asking for smooth, just different." "Well, you certainly got that." His expression grew serious again. "Katherine, if we make it through this, if we reach Durango safely." "When," she corrected firmly. "When we reach Durango." The conviction in her voice seemed to strengthen him. "When we reach Durango, I want to ask you something important." He hesitated. "But not here, not like this." Katherine felt her heart quicken, understanding instinctively what he meant. "I'll hold you to that," she said softly. The rest of the night passed in tense vigilance, but the expected second attack never came. By dawn, Howard made the decision to move on, rigging a travois for the injured Davis and posting Monroe and Jenkins as flanking guards as they proceeded along the trail. "We push hard today," he announced. "With luck, we'll reach Durango by nightfall." The day's journey was tense. Every rider on the horizon a potential threat. Every unusual sound a reason to reach for weapons. Katherine rode beside Howard on the wagon seat, her injured ankle forgotten in the face of greater dangers. They spoke little, but the silence between them was filled with unspoken understanding and shared resolve. Late in the afternoon, they crested a rise to see Durango spread before them in the valley, below a growing settlement of wooden buildings clustered around the newly constructed railroad line. "We made it," Katherine breathed, relief washing over her like a physical force. Howard's weather-lined face softened as he looked at her. "Did you doubt we would?" "Not with you leading us," she admitted. The mining company's office received them with surprise and concern, quickly sending for a doctor to tend to Davis and arranging proper accommodations for the exhausted travelers. The payroll was secured, telegrams dispatched about the Carson gang, and rewards offered for information leading to their capture. That evening, after being examined by the doctor and having her ankle properly bandaged, Katherine sat alone in a small private dining room at Durango's hotel. Howard had asked her to meet him there, and she waited nervously, smoothing the borrowed dress the hotel proprietor's wife had kindly loaned her. When Howard entered, she barely recognized him. Gone was the trail dust and stubble, replaced by a freshly bathed and shaved man in a clean white shirt. He'd even trimmed his hair, revealing more of the strong features she'd come to admire. "You clean up well, Mr. Lawson," she said as he approached the table. "As do you, Miss Hayes," he replied, his eyes taking in her appearance with open appreciation. "Though you were just as beautiful covered in trail dust." He joined her at the table, and for a time they simply enjoyed the luxury of a proper meal and safety. Howard informed her that a telegraph had come from the sheriff in a neighboring town. 2 members of the Carson gang had been captured seeking medical attention for gunshot wounds. "Your shot likely led to their capture," he told her with evident pride. "Not bad for a saloon girl from Silverton." Katherine smiled, feeling a newfound confidence that had nothing to do with words spoken or unspoken. "Former saloon girl," she corrected. "I don't think I can go back to that life now." "What will you do instead?" Howard asked, his expression carefully neutral. Katherine considered this. "I don't know yet, but I want more, something meaningful." Howard reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Katherine, I meant what I said last night. There's something I want to ask you." Her heart beat faster as she met his gaze. "Yes." "I'm not a man of many possessions," he began, his voice low and earnest. "My life has been spent on the move, never settling, never putting down roots. But these past days with you—" He paused, seemingly searching for the right words. I've begun to wonder what it might be like to build something lasting." "Are you asking me to help you build it?" Katherine asked softly. His smile deepened. "I'm asking if you'd consider traveling with me a while longer, not as a cook for hire, but as a companion, a partner." He hesitated. "I can't offer you a settled life, at least not yet. But I can promise you'll never be mocked for your nature, and your voice, whether speaking or silent, will always be valued." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that this man truly saw her not as the town had labeled her, not as she had limited herself to be, but as she could become. "My father used to say that the greatest journeys often begin with a single word," she said, her voice steady despite her emotion. "My word to you is yes." Howard's face transformed with joy, years seeming to fall away from his weathered features. He raised her hand to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on her knuckles. "That's the most beautiful word I've ever heard." 3 weeks later, Katherine stood on the platform of Durango's railway station, watching as Howard secured their luggage for the journey eastward. The mining company, impressed by their handling of the Carson Gang incident, had offered Howard a position overseeing security for their Denver operations, a job that would allow for a more settled life while still utilizing his unique skills. Katherine had her own prospects as well. Her quiet competence and surprising courage during the journey had not gone unnoticed. The wife of the mining company's owner, learning of Katherine's education and literacy, had offered her a position as a teacher in the company's newly established school for employees' children. "Ready?" Howard asked, returning to her side and offering his arm. Katherine took it, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. "Where to first?" "Denver to start," he replied as they boarded the train. "Then wherever we decide, together." As the train pulled away from Durango, Katherine looked out the window at the mountains that had been both challenge and revelation. In their shadows, she had found her voice and her courage. In their vastness, she had discovered that silence could be a strength rather than a weakness. Howard settled beside her, his hand finding hers with the ease of growing familiarity. "Penny for your thoughts," Katherine smiled, no longer afraid to share them. "I was thinking about silence, about how sometimes it takes the right person to hear what isn't being said." Howard's expression softened as he looked at her. "Your silence spoke volumes to me from the first moment, Katherine, but I must admit, I've grown rather fond of your words as well." As the train carried them toward their future, Katherine Hayes leaned her head against the shoulder of the man who had valued her silence and celebrated her voice. Behind them lay Silverton with its narrow judgments and painful memories. Ahead stretched a life neither of them could have imagined alone, one where words and silence each had their proper place, and both were equally cherished. 5 years later, the Hayes Lawson home on the outskirts of Denver bustled with activity. Katherine moved through the kitchen, directing the preparations for their anniversary celebration with the quiet authority she had developed as both a teacher and a wife. "Mama," called a small voice from the doorway. "Papa says the guests are arriving." Katherine smiled at her 4-year-old son, Henry, named for Howard's father. "Tell Papa I'll be right there." From their humble beginnings had grown a life neither could have anticipated. Howard's position with the mining company had expanded into a consulting role that allowed him to train security personnel across the territory. Katherine divided her time between teaching at the company school and raising their son, with another child expected in the spring. Their home had become a gathering place for a diverse circle of friends, former rangers, mining executives, teachers, and even a few reformed outlaws Howard had encountered in his previous life. What united this unlikely assembly was the respect that permeated the Hayes-Lawson household, respect for different paths, different voices, different ways of moving through the world. As Katherine joined her husband on their front porch to welcome their guests, she felt his arm slip around her waist, his hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of their coming child. "Happy?" he asked softly, the question he still posed regularly, as if amazed by their good fortune. Katherine nodded, leaning into his embrace. "Very." Later, as twilight settled over the gathering and their friends shared stories around the fireplace, Howard rose to propose a toast. The room quieted, all eyes turning to the man whose steady presence commanded attention without demanding it. "5 years ago," he began, his gaze finding Katherine's across the room, "I met a woman who taught me that the most important things are often said in silence." He raised his glass. "To Katherine, who speaks volumes in everything she does." As their friends echoed the toast, Katherine felt a fullness in her heart that transcended words. From the shy girl mocked in Silverton's saloon to the confident woman she had become, the journey had been as much internal as geographical. That night, after the guests had departed and Henry was tucked into bed, Katherine and Howard stood together on their back porch, watching the stars emerge above the distant mountains. "Remember that first night on the trail?" Howard asked, his voice low with memory. "When you told me you wanted to stop being afraid of your own voice," Katherine nodded, thinking of how far they had come. "I remember. I knew then," he confessed, "that I wanted to hear that voice for the rest of my life, whether speaking or silent." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "You've given me more than I ever thought to ask for, Katherine." She stepped closer, resting her head against his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. "As have you. You heard me when no one else bothered to listen." As they stood together under the vast Colorado sky, Katherine Hayes Lawson reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led her here. The mockery that had once wounded her so deeply now seemed distant and insignificant compared to the life she had built, a life where her quietness was recognized not as a flaw, but as the thoughtful, contemplative strength it had always been. In Howard's arms, surrounded by the home and family they had created together, Katherine understood the profound truth that had changed everything. Sometimes the loudest hearts speak in the quietest voices, and the greatest love stories unfold not in grand declarations, but in the sacred spaces between words, where silence speaks volumes to those wise enough to listen.